The man who succeeds anywhere stays there. This is our home. Let us stay here.
When Douglass first moved his family to Rochester, New York in 1847, it was a town of 30 or so thousand people with a small African-American community of perhaps 600. He was already at that point the most sought-after abolitionist speaker on the American Anti-Slavery Society circuit.
He was very charismatic, he was very handsome, he was very intelligent. When he spoke, people listened and flocked to him. Everywhere he went, he was like a rock star.
He had already published his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, in 1845.
Read this book and you will see that this man's story is extraordinary. He was born into slavery. The work that this man did, when you consider the most humble beginnings of a life, not being able to read, not being able to know your mother, that's an extraordinary life, and it's the kind of life that is inspiring to me, right? And I think it's inspiring to everybody that comes in contact with that story.
Everywhere he went, audiences clamored for Douglass, even as other abolitionist speakers strained to make themselves heard. Increasingly at odds with his American Anti-Slavery Society colleagues for personal and philosophical principles, his move to Rochester was thus a professional and personal journey and culmination.
He's far more of a magnetic speaker than William Lloyd Garrison or any of the guys that were on the American Anti-Slavery Society circuit. And so just, famously, Garrison would start a meeting by saying, "Hi, I'm William Lloyd Garrison, I'm here, blah, 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 to talk to you about this." And people would start chanting, "Douglass, Douglass, Douglass, Douglass," because they wanted Douglass to come up.
Rochester was not, however, a racist-free utopia. Most white Americans of the mid-19th century, even those committed to abolition, would have held racist ideas about African American men and women, and most white Americans did not want African Americans living in their neighborhoods. Douglass was thus fortunate to be able to purchase a comfortable home in a middle-class neighborhood from an abolitionist ally. He was a highly respected speaker, writer, and organizer, whose recent UK tour had resulted in the purchase of his freedom and the funding for his newspaper. As such, he sought to live in a middle-class neighborhood and send his children to schools in that environment. He met with some resistance to these efforts. He bought the house despite the protests of his neighbors. His grace and personality, however, soon won them over, and before long, the Alexander Street home of America's most famous abolitionist was ringed by children, black and white, playing in the yard, listening to Douglass play the fiddle.
I think the folks in Rochester who lived in the community experienced a very different side. He was famously known to play the fiddle. And he would apparently play the fiddle in the yard, and kids would come around and hang out with his kids, and there was sort of a really good feeling there. What's more interesting about his charisma is that one of the central ideas behind slavery is that African Americans are racially inferior, right? The ideal of the American Revolution is republicanism, the independent citizen. If you're a person who believes in the values of the American Revolution and you're a Christian, how do you hold other human beings in slavery, right? And the idea is that they have to construct these human beings as being racially inferior and present themselves as great patriarchs watching out for their children. This is the will of God and all of this kind of stuff. And so they construct these huge intellectual edifices, legitimizing slavery on the basis of presumed racial inferiority. And then comes Douglass, who is, at any single time, he's the smartest guy in the room. So that charisma was actually a weapon against the institution of slavery because it undermined the theory of racial inferiority.
Douglass used the home and his Tallman Building printing press office as central stops on a busy and successful Underground Railroad to freedom. In his time in Rochester, Douglass, his family, and their allies moved hundreds of fugitives from slavery through the community to freedom in Canada.